Hello, everybody. This is LucidCTA coming to you not so live from Fairfax, Virginia, and I'm here with my good friend Tyler Colby. Tyler is one of the top, if not the top, data minds that I have had the pleasure of working with, interacting with, and being inspired by. And I decided to bring him over to my podcast so that you can get inspired by him and his work. And so Tyler's been working in the nonprofit world for about 17 years. Then he took a departure and went and worked at Odaseva, which is, of course, a premier creator of Salesforce backup and archive, backup restore archiving solutions. So it's a great product and services. So when he was there, I was learning about the Odaseva platform, and Tyler was kind enough to walk me through this and teach me how it works, the ins and outs. And then we became friends, and now he is transitioning back into the nonprofit world. So in this interlude, he's been refining his product, which has been more like a project, a labor of love, and he's calling it Pathfinder. That's the interim name. It may, of course, change when it's market ready. And so right now it's a labor of love. So look at it as not as a product, but as something that Tyler has been iterating on to keep his mind extremely sharp. Not that he needs it, but it doesn't hurt. And here we are. So he'll tell us more about that and all things data. So welcome, Senior Colby. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Sven. It's great to be here today.
All right. So tell me more about this and how did this come to be? Also, there's something called Bloomerang. So please tell us all about that.
Certainly. So we'll jump into all things nonprofit, but we're also going to be focused a lot on just data migration and the process of data migration. You saying Bloomerang here, it's going to be the demo system. That's the legacy system that we're going to walk through for our Bay Area food bank migration that we're talking through in our demo instance here today. But Bloomerang is one of many nonprofit CRMs. It's used by a number of food banks in particular, but a number of organizations across. It's one of the more simple nonprofit CRMs. So as we get into it, it just allowed us to kind of look through the schemas in a little bit easier way. As we look into the nonprofit ecosystem, there's a lot of different legacy CRMs that organizations are going to be moving from. So Razor's Edge is one of the most popular that you're going to see. There's a lot of Microsoft Dynamics and HubSpot nonprofit as well. So a lot of different options for what that legacy system is going to be and moving that data into nonprofit cloud. But that destination endpoint could be just about anything. So as we're looking through the tool today, it's really a data migration platform standardizing the processes that a data migration expert is going to be utilizing as they're going through one of these engagements to make sure that it's a repeatable process, to make sure that they're following the right standards and keeping that data secure, and also being able to communicate with their client exactly what's happening during this data migration.
That sounds amazing. So most people actually dread data migrations. It's something that's like a necessary evil and all the cleansing, enrichment, and validation that has to happen. And so there's usually you even think of either it's data loader, it's Excel connector, or it's an ETL like informatics, and you need specialized skills. And I think you're the only person I've ever met who actually loves data migrations and deduplication. So here you are. I couldn't think of a more perfect person to talk to about this.
You add identity resolution to that list, and yeah, you're getting my favorite three things in the entire world. You know, I think moving data is a fascinating exercise. It's like a big puzzle to me. You have a million different ways that this data could move. And it informs so much of the project. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there with what is being used currently in consultancies and how it's really dreaded a lot of times in agencies. It often then stretches into a process that's much longer than it typically needs to be. because the tooling that's being utilized for it is just not the correct set of tools. So when you think of mapping out an entire org and an entire schema, you may be talking hundreds of objects, thousands and thousands of fields, and the number of transformations that are going to be needed to make sure that it's moved effectively into Salesforce, that you're not just lifting and shifting and copying bad patterns, but also retaining all of that data is a huge exercise, not just technically. So it's not just that data transfer, not just the data movement. It's also a huge communication exercise between you and your customers as well. So how do we make sure that organizations are comfortable with the move, that they can sign off on it and they know exactly where it is, that their data's gone? And then when you're at the end of the project, that data has been moved appropriately. So absolutely, a lot of items that go into the data migration process. And just when we look at the tools that are on the shelf today, data loader is always the biggest one. It's at this point a robust platform. We don't really have Workbench if you want to stay truly secure, unless you're hosting your own Workbench. But all of the tools that come into data migration are different than working with just live sales. And those tools are really built for putting in some segments of data, but not executing a whole lift and shift from a legacy org into the new Salesforce.
I mean, I can't imagine anything more valuable, because usually what I hear from clients is, I want to work with my real data. And as insecure as that is, they bring up a good point. They say, so I need to make sure that it's built correctly. And the only way I can find out or be sure that it was built correctly, that's if I'm able to see my real data, so I can compare what I currently have to the new desired state. So if they're able to follow the migration along, if they get this extra assurance that it was done correctly, then it's really not necessary to compromise the integrity of that data or privacy of the data as you're working on actual build out of the product, whatever that may be. So that's sounds pretty fascinating. So, all right. So how does this compare to the basic tools that we know, and some people love them, some people hate them? Data Loader, you mentioned, that's of course a free one. There's Data Loader IO. There is also some of the Excel connector that connects Excel. So those seem to be a lot more rudimentary than what you're talking about. And how does your solution scale to, terabyte level orgs? Does it?
Certainly. So, as I was building this platform, it was informed by first the complexity of nonprofit. And there's an old joke that if you want to see the most complicated data models, take a look at an old nonprofit that has 20 interconnected Excel sheets, because some of the algorithms that they're going to use to just derive their numbers and keep everything going within a nonprofit can get extremely complex. But also, it's usually a bunch of people that have their hands on keyboard and then go out and are doing. So it's not that they're sitting around enforcing data standards. If you think, a food bank that started with just a few people and then grew and grew, they may not have those dedicated systems over time. But even when you do, nonprofits are serving so many different facets of the community typically. So, and the technology that they may have chosen may not be the standard technologies that we're used to. So they may not have governance teams. They may not have, huge IT teams in order to really enforce what are best practices and think through what is that data movement, especially into a modern system like Salesforce Nonprofit Cloud or any of the other platforms that currently exist and are well supported. So when you put that into perspective, the schemas that you'll start to see just get really complex. But then that second part of it, that scale part, and this is really informed by my time at Odaseva, was dealing with organizations that aren't just in the single terabyte range, but starting to hit those double-digit terabytes. One of the largest I worked with was 15 terabytes of data, 35 terabytes of files. When you start to work with data at that scale, things also have to function a little bit differently, and you have to think in different patterns as well. So everything that we'll go through today, it's built in Rust, so it is high performant. I build board games on the side. I also build little robots. So everything that I do is typically in Rust programming, and that just allowed me to really parallelize items, get items to a place where we can work out with them as we scale up to that terabyte scale, while retaining that look at the complexity of the schema as well. So, making sure that all those mappings are in place, but we're also dealing with large or extreme data volumes as well.
And so you picked Rust specifically for its hyper efficiency. Is that the main reason?
Hyper efficiency is a great way to put it. There's a lot of reasons under the hood technically, and this isn't a Rust programming podcast, but if you start looking into the performance of it, especially if you've been in the Salesforce world for a long time and just really working in Apex, and then you switch over to something like this, if you've done maybe a little Python programming as well, versus Python, you're usually looking at 15 to 20x speed up, and that's 15 to 20x. So extreme efficiency comparatively. And the way that you can then parallelize as well across a number of different streams is really fantastic. So as we start, again, getting into that terabyte scale or double-digit terabyte scale, the ability to handle large data volumes with ease is really, it makes it a lot easier, and the code is extremely maintained. So there's a lot of great platforms and great packages that you can use as you start to kind of scale up into those huge data volumes as well.
Okay, gotcha. And so a little bit more on the definition end of things. So you mentioned Nonprofit Cloud, and most people equate that to NPSP, which is Nonprofit Success Pack from Salesforce. Is this one and the same, or how are they different? Is NPSP the entry point to Nonprofit Cloud?
So NPSP and Nonprofit Cloud are two very distinct platforms. They have two completely different data models. NPSP was a community-supported platform. So for a number of years, it was devoted portions of the community that came together and helped build that, along with Salesforce.org. Nonprofit Cloud is Salesforce.org's entry. It was launched just a few years ago and is a modernization of NPSP. When Nonprofit Cloud was launched, there was a deprecation then of the NPSP platform. So it's still sitting on API 53 of Salesforce. I believe we're on API 66, if I remember correctly now.
I think it's 67 already, yeah.
60, I think we're at 67 already. So it has been sitting there. There are still tens of thousands of organizations that are on NPSP. It is still available on GitHub. There have started to be forks of NPSP. So a couple of organizations that I'm aware of have started to fork it and modernize it as one migration path. However, most of the time in the general Salesforce recommendation currently is to move from NPSP over to Nonprofit Cloud so that you get the full support of Salesforce behind it. That would include everything like Agentforce and all of the modern tooling that they have available.
Gotcha. Well, so not the same thing. So thank you for disambiguating this, because some people use them interchangeably. All right. And so how do we also overcome data cleanliness uncertainty?
Data cleanliness is a huge item. Now, we're not going to be touching on that today. It's coming in the next version of the platform that's currently under construction. I do have it as CLI commands and items behind the scene, but when it comes to data cleanliness, it's not just duplicates. Duplicates is a huge issue and something that you definitely want to address during. So clustering your duplicates, and there's a number of platforms that you can use today and a number of methods that you can use to apply to it. It also will typically, in a data migration, become an identity resolution error. So again, that third thing that I'm just in love with, because you're typically, when working with a client, not just going to be migrating them from a platform over to wherever your Salesforce destination endpoint is. You're also going to be given likely a number of CSVs, other data sources, and other items that are coming in where that data may not match up 100% correctly. Along with that, you're going to have a lot of data that is just dirty. And we always talk about, moving dirty data in is just not a great best practice. You don't want to keep the old issues that you had in your old database and then migrate them into the new database. But how do you start detecting that at scale? And that can be anything from data standardization. So how do we store data? So think telephone numbers and all the different ways that you can type that in. There's a ton of permutations from having the plus, with the country code in front of it. You can have the parentheses, dashes in a certain place. You could have it all as a text string. How do you maintain data standards across your entire database so that as you're starting to work with this and as you're starting to layer on all of those Salesforce functions, that it's going to work with your data, even if it was migrated from a system that is 15, 20, 50 years old, I've seen. So, how do you make sure that these data standards follow through to your new system and it's nice and clean?
So you actually seek out all these difficulties and intentionally make your life more complicated so that it's actually easier for us. Thank you for doing that. Yeah. Thank you. Much appreciated. All right. Oh, well, at any point when you're ready, fire up your wonderful product and let's see it.
Sure. So as we jump into Pathfinder, a lot of items within here are really, again, meant for the data migration professional and meant to walk through the different stages of what it is working with a client to get you all the way from that first connection all the way through the migration process and then validating that data is correct at the end as well. So there's a lot of steps that go into putting together a data migration to make sure that it is robust, again, that it is communicated well to the client as well, and that it is complete across the board. So number of items that are right here on the dashboard, and you can see today we're going to be talking again about the Bay Area Food Bank and just helping them get through. So demo instance, not a real client. So as we come in, first item with the data migration is always going to be getting a view into what is the data that we're actually migrating. So again, before we talked about Bloomerang being one of those nonprofit donor management platforms. So we're connected to one of those. We can also connect to items like Blackbaud systems, so Razer's Edge. We can do CSV imports, Microsoft Dynamics. A number of other connectors are already pre-built into the system to make sure that we can get that full and robust item and full and robust migration from their legacy systems over to a Salesforce, in this case, Nonprofit Cloud. Mm-hmm. Where you're going to spend the most time in migrations is going to be the mapping procedures, though. And this is a huge endeavor and one that, as you said before, usually gets done in Excel or a Google Doc. And it's just can be tens of thousands of fields if you really start to look at an enterprise level migration. So we have just a few of them on the page here. You can see that we've already mapped constituent over to account. We've mapped fund into fund, campaign into campaign. But we have a little bit of work to do on items like transaction and our recurring gifts down here. So as I come into our constituent to account, you can see here we have a number of fields that are already mapped and they're already approved. So there's going to be a lot that are very easy to see. We do have an auto map feature built in as well. So that'll do your first pass for you to make sure that all of the common connections, again, first name to first name is a no-brainer. We should just be able to port that data over. But say we have a field like this mobile phone and it's not mapped currently, we can just click and drag it right over. And you can see that instead of a green arrow, we're given a purple arrow for this item. Mm-hmm. That is going to be in the needs review status. So it's a new mapping. We don't know from the client yet that this is exactly where it is. And part of the reason for that is we're going to have some data quality issues, just like we talked about before with that telephone number. There's a lot of formats that we can apply to that telephone number. So it's going to start off in the needs review status. Within any of these mappings and transformations, we can come into the expression and we can start to apply different kinds of patterns to this data. And you can think kind of like Formula Builder. If you're an admin inside of Salesforce, it works very much the same way. But like any ETL platform, there's a lot of transformations that you may need to apply to this data. in order to make sure that it conforms to our new data standards. Built in, I do have the format phone. We have a number of different output formats that are within the documentation that you can apply to this data so that you're then applying the right data format to that specific field so that as it's coming into the new system, again, you have that data cleanliness and data standardization being applied right away. We can also apply conditionals to this data as well. So think in this case, if you see this value, do this with it. If you see that value, do this with it. So a lot of times, data is going to be stored in a different way. Blackbaud is famous for having one master table and a ton of tables coming off of it versus Salesforce, which is very hierarchical. So because of that, instead of having one master table in the middle, you may have huge conditionals coming off of it where that data is going to be branching in a bunch of different directions at the same time. All of those items can be put in so that we can say, if it's an individual organization foundation, then apply this transformation. So add this condition to the data so that it's moving into the correct fields and to the correct objects as well.
Gotcha. All right. Very interesting. So this looks like a pretty familiar interface, and a lot of people are going to say, well, it's the same as Data Cloud. So how is this different from Data Cloud? Do you have to pump it somewhere else first before you can use it?
The big difference with Data Cloud and this tool is this is meant for the data migration professional, not for the organization. So this runs locally. So whenever I work with clients to do data migrations with colbysdatamovers.com, as you come in, all clients are provisioned a single hard drive. It's an encrypted AES 256 hard drive so that as I'm working with any client, that data is completely segmented. Once we pull down the data, it's usually kill the internet connection on that device as well, so that all the data is working with offline in a fully encrypted format so that if anything were to happen, we have air gapping in place. So we can just unplug that hard drive at any time. And then when an engagement is done, we do a NIST wipe. So it's a full NIST data deletion from that hard drive, and we send the certification off. Data Cloud is not that. Data Cloud is meant to persist. It's in the cloud. It's in the name. And the difference in security there and the items that you have to think about is way different. So as you're working with Data Cloud, you're really looking at that ongoing movement of data, right? So how am I moving this data? How am I synchronizing it across platforms? This is a huge lift and shift. So we're going to have a full copy as a data migration consultant of all of their legacy data. That is the crown jewel of an organization. There's a lot of press these days about things like data breaches, and something that I will just tout Odaseva for taking a fantastic pattern on, because they encrypt that data into no view status at all times as they're working ongoing with their clients. But as we're taking a look at housing 100% of that organization's data, that really opens up the vector for huge data breach. So this is not meant for the exact same scenario. It's not meant for ongoing org syncing and org synchronization. This is meant for the one time, let's move from a legacy system into a new system, and let's set up all those mappings, and let's do so as securely as possible. So when we provision a hard drive, it runs just on that hard drive.
Gotcha. So you mentioned a few terms here that I'd like to also define for the audience. So when you say full copy, you don't mean the full copy sandbox for Salesforce, which not everybody's going to have. That usually is a luxury. It comes with the unlimited edition. Literally the full copy of production. So however big production is, that's how much the full copy is going to store. And it typically costs, well, check with your AE, 10% of your yearly spend. So that Salesforce NIST is, of course, National Institute for Science and Technology, or Standards and Technology, I believe, right? And that's a government agency, so they have their own standards that they set for all kinds of things, so including what does it mean to completely delete something, right? So if you want to make your data completely undetectable by electron microscope, means it's really gone. So you certify that. And that's, of course, very important because cloud-based tools need to go through the FedRAMP process, and they need to be authorized as safe for use by various government agencies. And it's a very multi-year long process. Own Backup went through that process. Odaseva, as far as I know, has not. But this particular tool does not need to go through this process because it is locally installed. So it could be running behind the firewall. So it is not a cloud-based system, which is also what makes it so fast, right, and efficient. So did I say all these things correctly from 100%. Your perspective? Okay, 100% cool.
100% nailed it on the head. And I think you hit a couple of the key points that I would just double click on of, because this is running locally, we're not waiting on cloud resources, but we're also not relying on any of the transit systems that are in place for cloud mechanisms. So TLS 1.2, 1.3, there's a number of organizations that don't even trust TLS. As you move into working with, today we're talking a lot about nonprofit, but as you move into working with huge financials and huge healthcare organizations where that data is incredibly regulated. So, large compliance, not only from the SEC, FINRA, or, health organizations, it is imperative that you keep that data as sensitive as possible. As you start moving into governmental organizations as well, and there's a lot of government cloud, GovCloud work that occurs as well. How do you move GovCloud data from an old, possibly mainframe system a lot of times, but these old systems into Salesforce GovCloud and ensure that data is completely secure, but that when your engagement is complete, that you're also keeping that data safe as well. So there's not data that's persisting on a hard drive that's just sitting in your closet, that some point in time somebody could come and take it from you. That is a huge vector, again, of data breach. So making sure that it is as critically locked down at all times. That's why I said even before, you may even be pulling down that data or working behind the firewall, getting that data on a laptop, and then completely killing the connection at the end. I've had organizations that forced me on site before. So all the work had to be done within their organization and on their local network, just because of those data privacy standards.
So I can say, as make an observation, there's a couple of people who love acronyms. So there's the government, there's the military, and of course the nerds like us, the architects. So you mentioned TLS. So I have to mention that TLS stands for Transport Layer Security. The latest version right now is version 1.3, supported by Salesforce as of February 18th, I believe, or even prior, but as of today, that's the latest version. And it is not the same as SSL, and that's an older, weaker standard, so that's Secure Sockets Layer. So TLS is what you need to be able to protect the data in transit. Again, not the same as Shield. Shield platform encryption is to protect the data at rest while it's in Salesforce, inside of Salesforce. TLS is when the data moves, and so we can get into cryptology later if time permits, but in this case, this is just not even touched because we're dealing with data in a local hosted environment. All right, I think we beat that point to death. Let's move on. Thank you.
So as we get these mappings set, and you would want to go through with your client, make sure that each one of these fields is going to be hit, that we turn all of these purple arrows into green. And for that, we would just come down here and go down to approve. That'll switch this over to green. We can add notes about this mapping. But as we get into it, we can then get into the migration process itself. So with the migration process, we can kick off this migration. Now, this is a demo instance, so it likely won't go through, but this will give you an activity log. So detailed logging as to what's happening at every single stage as it's performing. Again, demo instance, so it's not actually going to be loading in. But what it's going to give us at the end is a list of what are all the conflicts that we hit during this data migration. So no matter how much you plan during that mapping phase, you will likely still hit a number of data conflicts within here. These can range everything from the data's not clean, or if we're doing delta migration, so you mentioned before, a lot of clients will want to see a version of their data into Salesforce. If we don't delete that data after doing a initial delta migration, and we have a newer version, so say our users got in and they started making changes with it, we may see items like this where the salutation has now changed, or the first name has changed, or we have a little bit of a different suffix. So how do we keep on top of these small differences between what's a legacy system and what's the source system? And then think also, if we have multiple data legacy systems that are now moving into Salesforce, we may have a little bit different name in every single one of them. So the system is smart enough to pick up when it is that we should have a match here. So you can see Rob here is very close across a number of fields. How do we say which value wins? So we can say the source or the target wins. We can do a smart merge, so that'll prefer the non-empty, the most complete fields, or we can do whatever is the newest record. So whoever last changed that record and what's the last modified, essentially, on that. We can do notes on this and resolve the conflict then, or we can just do the AI one and it'll do it for us. After you do this with every field, you can see here we have a hyphenated field name.
Those are always tough, yeah.
Yeah, never fun. So we can start to see, what's pending, what's been resolved. And then as we start to resolve these, we can then remigrate that data into the source or into the destination system to make sure that we have a full, complete picture of what that data is. So you're going to hit this across a number of objects. Again, data cleanliness issues, data update issues, delta migrations can cause this, but data conflicts should be expected, and they should be easily communicated to the customer as well.
So once again, for our viewers now, I'm always thinking about CTA candidates who are learning about all these various concepts. So delta is basically difference, right? So you migrate on the first pass, and now your users keep working with the existing data set before the new system has been finished and ready for them to start using. So that's called the cutover, when you switch between systems permanently. And delta is that difference. So you don't need to recopy the entire data set, but only what changed. And the system will detect those changes for you and basically said, okay, how do you want to deconflict things? So not that different of a concept from, let's say, code changed, and then we need to say, okay, which is the correct version. So that's also a similar concept applies, I believe, to identity resolution, right? So again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just a generalist architect, and you're the pro data architect.
You hit a lot of those points exactly correct. So when you're doing a delta migration, typically the scenario is we can't have downtime within our organization, but we want to start moving some functions to Salesforce, but keep some functions on these legacy systems. So we know that these systems are battle tested. They've been working for us for years, but we want to start moving, if we're using our nonprofit analogy, say our donor module. So we're going to do all of our donations here, but all of our volunteer items are still happening over here. So you may be serving your customers, your constituents, whatever you're going to call them, in two different places at the same time, while you work through functionally moving each team off or moving each function of a team off of that legacy system. Because you're not lifting and shifting and having that hard cutoff date with many of these migrations, a delta migration means you're moving portions of data or refreshing the movement of data multiple times during an engagement. And because that data is always changing, as just the organization shifts, as your customers and constituents, again, we went through very common scenarios, adding a prefix, adding a suffix, last name changes, things of that, telephone number changes, address changes. As all of those items propagate in the system, those become data conflicts. So items that we have to then resolve and say, well, which version of the data is winning? It's a concept that is in Data Cloud here today. It's in a number of ETL platforms as well, but just making sure that as we're doing that big lift and shift, that data migration, that we're also accounting for it here as well.
Got it. Okay. Very cool.
And as you end the migration overall, really as we start to look at what is it that we're leaving with the customer and how are we communicating this throughout the engagement, there's a number of analyses that are ready to go. So what are we looking at as far as critical issues, the mappings, what recommendations do we have, and starting to build out a communication pattern for when you're working with that client. So taking a look at each and every object, each and every table from the legacy system, and making sure that we're clearly communicating, these are the items that we still have to focus on, and generating nice looking reports. So again, if we think back to what you said at the beginning, working through Google Docs, working through Excel to generate all of these mappings, the hard thing is really just almost an analysis paralysis that comes with that, because there's so much data that's going to be on those pages, and filtering through tens of thousands of fields can get very difficult. So pulling it into a format that's very easy to understand, review recommended, action required, or this is looking excellent right now. So letting your client know, this is where we need to focus, this is where we need to spend time to make sure that your data migration is successful overall. Now, this is just the front end of a few features that are overall. Data migration consultants, as probably we've chatted a number of times before, keep a lot of scripts. So there's a lot of patterns that we'll maintain over the years. If you think of working on the front end of Salesforce, right, and all the Lightning Web Component libraries that organizations maintain, or Slack integration, Agentforce now, patterns that are maintained, those can grow and grow. The data migration consulting experts definitely keep their own as well. So as we start to work with systems like Dynamics or Razor's Edge, I've brought up a number of times, HubSpot, and we're moving and shifting this data from legacy over to Salesforce or from destination to source. Mm-hmm. There's a number of just common patterns that will come in. So there's a lot that's built in kind of under the scenes here as well. So documentation is all built in for how to access all of those, just in case it's needed as well. So the full Rust backend has a lot of other features as well. But the key thing is that this is all one client, one system, one machine, and all stored off on its own hard drive as well. So runs locally, just like we talked about before.
So I'm glad you mentioned documentation. And it sounds like the other thing is, who are the key people during the migration process? So you've got the clients, of course, and you would hope that they know their own data. And if we're lucky enough to work with a big enough client, they would have dedicated people called data stewards. But if you don't have those situations, right, it's not a happy path. If you don't have a data steward, if you have a solo admin who basically wears multiple hats, and then, of course, the executives need to verify it and validate everything and approve, how would this approach actually make things happen so that you're not stuck in analysis paralysis? What would make their life easier and actually the project successful?
So first part of that question, what personas are you working with as a data migration consultant, is a great one. And it should be everybody that you can really get in front of at an organization, because you're going to find that a lot of times your admins have one view of the data, your power users, your subject matter experts have another view of the data. How are they actually using it on a day-to-day basis? When they see this, what are they actually doing? I've walked into many teams, and there's the way that the governance teams and the architect teams think the data should work. And then there's the way that the users are actually using the data today. And sometimes those can be very aligned. But if processes aren't rigidly defined and communicated to their users, and that training item isn't done thoroughly, then they may be storing data in any place. And you may find data in wrong places. You may find that it's been stored over here or over there, that I account for this situation like this, but Bob that's sitting in the terminal over here is accounting for it like this. So, making sure that you really get that full and complete view of an organization. And as you move from, I've worked with 2-person nonprofits ready to save the world and a great mission, but maybe not the best data standards, all the way up to some of the largest organizations with, governance teams, COEs, and great data standards that are rigidly defined. It's almost easier to work with your enterprise systems because they have a great grasp, it's well documented, and there are those guardrails around the data. So when you get to that messy scale where things aren't governed, where things haven't been really rigidly trained and standardized, it has to be able to account for multiple personas of kind of acumen. So how familiar are we with the systems of the data? How familiar are we with data in general? And how does this really going to affect us in the long term? So as we were going through that data profile just a moment ago, this is why I tried to make it as colorful as possible. So usually this allows, at a glance then, just to see what is it that we need to be focusing on? Why is it that we're focusing on that item? So is this a data quality issue? Is this a standardization issue? Is it a duplicate issue? And what is it that's going to be our pathway in order to resolve this situation overall? So if we talk phone and we view these examples here, we can see just a few examples of what that transformation may look like in the end to bring that into a common format. Say we were planning for a Salesforce phone or Service Cloud phone implementation, we would be able to then say, okay, this is how we can store that data so that as we move into the telephony side, we have that data standardized for all of the triggers that we're going to need to make this data do omni-channel routing, et cetera.
Gotcha. Okay. So if you could scroll up a bit, because I saw, what did it say, about 78% ready for migration? Yeah, data mostly ready for migration. The way I think about this at a glance is that this is kind of a health check. Like there's a feature that was developed by a friend of mine, Gary Salama, who's now CEO of Valo AI. So the health check gives you a percentage representation of how secure your org is. And your attempt to do the same, so you can hit the critical issues, which below, I believe it says there's 150 some zip codes missing. So assuming we're working with US addresses, so how do we get those in? Is there going to be an integration with the US Postal Service database, and then you pull those in, and that's what basically elevates that score and makes that data set more complete, so you bring in the clean data into Salesforce? Or do you say, okay, you know what, I'm not going to do it right now, but I do have, let's say, Melissa data installed in Salesforce already, which is an aggregator of all the different databases of postal services from around the world, and I'm just going to do it there. So what would be a cleaner approach, in your opinion? What would you recommend?
Pre-cleaning versus post-cleaning is a great conversation, and one that you're going to have typically against a number of items, but that's why you want to put it all in front of your customers right away. So, whether it's the telephone number and doing this, or the zip code, or identity resolution with duplicate clusters, or any of the items that you're going to encounter when going through the thousands and thousands of fields between schema to schema, it's going to be, do we fix this pre, or do we fix this in post? I feel like I'm a video person making movies here. Do we fix
post-production, pre-production, right?
Post-production.
Yeah, I'm a fan of pre, personally.
I'm a fan of pre, personally. Whatever you can fix, you should fix in pre. But fixing it in pre also means that you're doing a data transformation and manipulating that data. So whenever you're manipulating that data in any way, so any transform that you apply means that there's a change occurring that they're going to have to then review and approve that it has done so correctly. So if we do a zip code lookup, they're going to need to ensure, okay, these examples do match what we would expect. So if we had 156 records within here that don't have zip codes, that's not a huge quantity to go through. But imagine again that you're working with 10 terabytes of data and a lift and shift data migration, and they have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, if not potentially even billions. That's not something that you can sit and one by one go through, even with teams of people. You may have to start taking segments of that data to validate that, yes, it is indeed the correct zip code that has been matched to it, and that package has correctly identified it as well. If you think of working with, say, a large logistics organization, sending thousands of packages, millions of packages per day, that zip coding is going to be crucially important to make sure a package gets delivered on time. If you think health information and we're refining that data to make sure that it's correct, you may be having impact into a person's personal health. So making sure that whatever that data is, because these conflicts are going to happen, these data enrichments will need to occur, that you're just making sure that client is well informed of what is it that we're seeing as the crucial gap right now. This is what's going to happen either, again, pre or post. So where are we fixing this? And then ensuring that data correctness is at the end is typically an engagement that you're going to do along with the customer to make sure that we have correctness across the board.
And so just looking at this example, the importance of having clean data and complete data cannot be overstated. So zip codes, of course, is something important for mailing. Can a package get somewhere without the zip code? Yes. However, a lot of addresses are the same or similar, but also you can use it for identity resolution. So if you're building that composite key and everything matches on the person's identity except for the zip code, so that could be an important data point right there. When I was working at Booz Allen, so of course my main client was U.S. Veterans Affairs. It's the second largest agency in the United States government, right after the Department of Defense. And a lot of those veterans, I'd say most of the veterans, rely on clean, correct addresses because that's where their prescriptions go. And some of them live in remote areas of the United States and they need to get their actual medicine shipped to them because they're not able to leave the house. So that's nothing to be ignored. That's not just a data point. But then the other one that you were showing on your screen was the email address. And you said 800 something were missing email addresses. So what's the importance of email address? Let's say, well, I'm primarily going to just mail things to my donors or my constituents, or I'm primarily just going to call them on the phone. Why do I need an email address? So what else is email usually used for?
So email can be used for a number of items. Identity resolution is a huge one. So typically a person will maintain an email address longer than they'll maintain a single address. Not always. And if you think of kind of tech consulting world, I don't know how many email addresses I even have at this point.
Too many to keep track of. Yes, same with me. Yeah.
So, you may have the problem, but if you think of how people typically interface with an organization, it is typically with an email address, and that communication is also a huge item as well. Now, there's a lot of people that don't like to share their email address for data privacy reasons, or maybe, again, they may have had a relationship with this organization predating email. Like you may see organizations that have relationships, especially in the nonprofit domain, that exist for 40, 50 years, and you're migrating this data in from the 1970s. When you have that length of communication with a customer, they may have never shared it, and you may only be communicating by telephone or by mail. But when it comes to identity resolution, it is a huge item because that telephone number shifts very often. Addresses, people move, they change their telephone numbers. All of those other items can be shifting data. Email is a great way a lot of times to really stitch together who is this person so that we're knowing exactly who we're communicating with. A lot of times in a lot of those identity resolution algorithms, how do we match and say that, SVET is SVET? It's one of the large items and it's weighted very heavily within there. So it's not something that can always be addressed. You can't necessarily take their email address and just add it to their contact record ID in every situation. There are data enrichment services that are available for Salesforce, and a number of them that can help you fill in some of those items. But typically you need to get explicit authorization from the customer as well in order to use that as a communication pattern.
Yeah, and email is considered mostly unique, but we cannot take that for granted because there's many cases where a husband and wife or two partners would share the same email address, or a family. So it could be something like Bob and Maggie at gmail.com. So, it's the same for Bob, it's the same for Maggie, right? So how do you know in this case? And you also mentioned weighting very heavily. So the whole concept of weighting, it's not a physical weight, right? But it's the number that you assign to a particular field. So for instance, what's the perfect example of that would be a social security number. If you're storing social security number, that is supposed to be unique per person. It never changes. It's permanent. It's immutable. And so that will probably get the 100%. It wins. Email address would be somewhere below that. Of course, the first name is lower, much lower. The last name is higher. But if you've got a combination of those things, you take an average score, that's what said, okay, this is the golden record, or this is the winning record. So that's something that I needed to have clear in my mind. I remember we were doing a huge deduplication project for Veterans Affairs. We were dealing with millions and millions of people. And this came up, of course, in a number of situations, like how do you weigh something, right? So again, if there's something that I'm saying here that's incorrect, please feel free to correct me. You're the expert here. Anything else to add?
100% correct on how you describe that. And I do think of them as physical weights because, they should be heavy, right? And the heavier it is, the more that it's important. So that social security number is one of the heaviest ones. You think of passport IDs and anything else that can be uniquely identified to a specific individual that may be tracked within your system. Encrypt those fields, by the way, because those are usually the most sensitive fields. But when you have a unique identifier, a truly unique identifier, it's important to weight that heavy within your identity resolution pipeline. But things that can be shared, so email address like you identified before, very common that husband and wife will share, or family members will share an email address, even less so, because you can have many household members and people moving very constantly. Telephone numbers change all the time. So even though it can be weighted, so it can have some weight, think of it the difference between like 100-pound dumbbell and a 10-pound dumbbell. So you're going to have 100 pounds on those truly unique identifiers, and then your smaller ones are going to be items that kind of fill in the rest of the data picture, especially when it comes to contact identity resolution. Yes.
And you also mentioned a couple of times, and I believe so did I, the concept of encryption. So what is it and why is it important, and what exactly does it mean in case of a data breach?
Oh, encryption's a huge one. We should just have another podcast.
I know. We'll have it. I think we just identified our next episode.
Yeah. So you mentioned before, and the big one within the Salesforce community is Salesforce Shield. So as you're storing data with Salesforce Shield, allows you to encrypt that data at rest. And encryption means that we're going to take a key and we're going to lock down a portion of that data. So it's going to be under AES 256 encryption within Salesforce, which is a specific algorithm to essentially scramble it. And without the key, it is unscrambleable until we get to quantum computers with 10,000 qubits. Now, when that data is sitting there, that's called at rest. So when you change that data, or when you extract that data from Salesforce, and even if that data is extracted with Salesforce Shield, if you're doing a full extraction with few encrypted fields on, that data is going to be extracted in plain text. So if you think of your social security numbers, credit card numbers, any other of that sensitive health information, if you do an extraction, you have few encrypted fields, that data expert's going to have full copy of the data in plain text sitting there. Now, hard drives can be encrypted with this, and as you're doing transit, so as that data moves from the cloud to your local device, there's also security that's built in there. So TLS has encryption built into it. Some organizations do not trust TLS, like we said before. So there's a couple of platforms out there. I'll shout out InCountry and Odaseva for having zero trust platforms that they can encrypt that data prior to sending it out over TLS 1.3 or 1.2. Some organizations are still
whatever the highest available at the time.
Exactly. So as you're sending it over TLS, some organizations don't trust it in transit because that data is so sensitive. So they'll actually pre-encrypt the data. So they'll extract it from Salesforce in plain text, re-encrypt it, then transport it over, and then decrypt it on the other side prior to loading it into Salesforce. So when you start getting into, what is it that you're guarding against is really going to be the big question. So who is it that we're trying to keep this data safe from? How sensitive is this data is the next question from that as well. So, is it social security numbers? Is it credit card? Is it financials? Is it health data, et cetera? Will inform what's the security precautions that we need to take around this specific set of data, whether it's sitting at rest or whether it's in transit at that time.
And not every organization takes that seriously, because I get notifications basically on a weekly basis by various services that I enjoy or pay for, such as pentester.com. That's currently my favorite. There's LifeLock, of course, and whatever credit monitoring agencies offer. And they say, well, your data is on the dark web, and this is your first name, last name, and email address. I'm like, okay, fine. The email address it's not that private anymore. But as you were mentioning, so if you take the entire data set and somebody just lifts it off of your org and just takes it and does something with it, if it's clear text, then they have access to everything. But if it's encrypted, or certain fields are encrypted, because you can't, with Shield, only encrypt up to 60 fields per object. And Unlimited Edition, you get 800 fields. By the way, if you're using 800 fields, there's something wrong going on there. It was way too many. But that means without this key, the decryption key, it's as good as locked, right? So you have the archive, but you can't use it. But the same principle applies to ransomware. If somebody gets access to your data, then they encrypt it, and then you cannot access your own data. Then you're hosed as well, right? And so that's a much bigger conversation there. Now, back to data migration. I have many different experiences with data migration over the years. How long does it take? That's usually the question from the client, but it's also the question for those folks who have never done it before, and say, okay, so data migration should be happening at what point in the project? Like, let's say you doing a Salesforce implementation, you're migrating from Bloomerang to Salesforce. At what point do I need to start migrating my data? Is it in the very beginning, in the middle, towards the end? How long do these things take? Like, you've seen it all, so please regale us with your knowledge.
It depends.
It depends is always the answer.
Here. It's always the answer here. So, again, I've worked with everything from the 2-person nonprofit with the mission to save the world, all the way up to some of the largest Salesforce orgs. You mentioned one before that we both got to talk about, kind of their data model, the overall functioning of everything as well. But as you look at, the difference between the orgs, it's going to really depend. So I've seen everything from 2-week engagements, because they're just sending me a few Excel sheets and CSVs, and I'm able to quickly transition everything over. And essentially, at that time, would just use a data loader to just move things in, simple mappings, data moved in fairly cleanly. There's not many decisions to make. You're probably talking a few dozen fields that need to be moved over, but not much is being tracked by the organization. And maybe they're pretty new. I've worked with a lot of organizations that are in that kind of first 3 to 5 years of existence, where they just have a handful of constituents, customers, connections that are being tracked within their CRM or whatever they're using as a CRM. Again, Excel sheets a lot of times. Those are very quick migrations, right? And when you think of moving that quantity of data over when you're in the hundreds or low thousands, very quick and easy. You can do it in a couple of weeks. But it will still likely be done at the same time as your functional side. So as you're working through what is it that we're putting in, as far as what users see, how they work with the system, and the different configurations, the different packages that we're putting in from the App Exchange, all of those items should be informing each other. So you should be working hand in hand both sides of the project, both that back-end data, but also what is going on with your development side and the architecture side, the solutioning side as well. As you start to scale up into enterprise and you start looking at that large scale, and this really applies to anywhere that has really admin or admin teams, all the way up to those COE teams, well-governed, tons of architects underneath, it's going to be a constant communication, and it should be informing the entire project as well, because there's going to be times where you find a tranche of data from the legacy system that's going to say, hey, what's going on with this table over here? This table of data, again, tables are just like objects in
object in Salesforce, right?
Yep. So if you say, hey, I have this table over here and it's storing all this data in this way, what's going on here? And they'll go, oh yeah, we forgot about that process. We stood that up a few years ago, but it's really important to us. That's all of a sudden going to need to be something that your functional team is going to need to be aware of, so that they're accounting for that in the new system. Or we're saying, oh, that's okay to jettison, that's okay to archive, that can be put into a long-term secure archive, so that we're holding that for the future and just for compliance purposes, and it doesn't need to be shifted over. But that needs to be a communication between you and the customer. So it should be that both sides are informing both the data and the front-end build, so that as you're going through, users are going to be aware of it, your architects, your admins, but also the consulting team that you're working with, or whatever the implementation team that you're working with is all working together with it. You mentioned multiple times as well, when is it that you're moving this data in? These items can also be occurring and moving items in over time to test. But one item that we didn't talk about is when you move that data in over time, what is it that you're exposing to your users? So one of the last items that's typically built within an overall implementation is going to be the security standards. So the who can see what within Salesforce. So it's very important that as you're moving in these critical data fields, so items that expose PII or other sensitive information, that there is some kind of anonymization, masking, tokenization, some kind of pattern is applied to that data, so that you're not exposing social security numbers, telephone numbers, or other data to users that may be coming in to do functional testing, but may not have access to that data in production when we would go live. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think, that was one item that was in the back of my head, like, oh, we got to talk about that.
That's also, the process of sandbox seeding, right? So as you seed the data of those sandboxes, like for instance, the developer or even partial copy, you get up to 10,000 records per object. So you're not going to get millions, right? So hopefully you don't have millions in your production instance either, because that's large data volume. Unless it's transactional, you archive it and you can have it in a warm or cold storage. But in this case, yes. So, and there are many tools out there that will anonymize your data for sandbox seeding. Now, obviously, your tool is not meant for that. It's really not meant to, seed those sandboxes. But the tools that are out there, so I believe Odaseva does that, GearSet, Copado Essentials to some degree as well. So there's numerous tools out there. That's just the best practice. Or what's even safer, synthetic data. You go to macaru.com and basically it's a bit of a pain to set up an initial template. You can use Snowfakery, all kinds of data factories. All that is so much better than not doing it and things leaking out, especially if you're working with like distributed teams and there's various countries and then there's data residency requirements. So you mentioned in country, by the way. So that solution is meant to overcome data residency requirements, right? So that solution by itself works on anonymization, but then how do you report on that data, right? So if you anonymize the data, then can you report very granularly? And the answer is usually not. But why do you report on anything? Is to make sure that you can make informed decisions, data-driven decisions. So in those cases, usually enough to aggregate the data sets, and there are certain macro numbers, and say what are our, like in the nonprofit context, our donations across a certain regions have reached the threshold. So now we can actually spin up a new hospital or something like that. So that's an aggregated data set. So, all right, very cool. So at this point, AI, is that a work in progress for you? Is that we saw a small component of AI in there, right? But like, where are you moving? What are you thinking of?
So, small component of AI. Let's jump on another one at another time and do a deep dive into where AI is going, MCP compatibility with this platform, and then something I call Salesforce Fabric, based on some of Daniel Miessler's work and his fabric patterns. But let's pull that into another one, because there's, I believe, 180 patterns currently that can all be stitched together. And if you think of working with Salesforce CLI today and the power of working with the command line, the ability to pass through multiple arguments at the same time, I have a nice visual builder that will be coming along with this. But let's bring that into our next conversation, Svet, and we can dive deep into getting, into powerful tools with this. Now, I will say, along with that, using AI along with data migration is not something that's recommended, because you may be exposing the data schema or sensitive information. So if you are going to use AI tools along with data migration work or any sensitive client information work when doing Salesforce consulting, ensure that you're using either offline tools completely, or that you're on a private instance of one of the major platforms that's through your employer and completely encrypted and segmented. We just actually saw, it was a major news story, the United States CISA, the Cyber Security Intelligence Administration, the head of the administration was putting their own documents into a public version of ChatGPT. That becomes training data. I know, Svet, I know. But that becomes training data that could be regurgitated long-term and then exfiltrated from organizations. So make sure that if you're working with sensitive information, you're not just putting it into your personal ChatGPT account to help you out with that overall, that you're using offline tools and that you're keeping that data completely secure, and then NIST wiping at the end of everything. So everything's deleted at the end as well.
Excellent. Well, let's, for our audience, consider that a teaser for the next episode or the one after that. So very cool. So this is one of those large subjects that we can, go on and on for hours, but I think this is going to be helpful also to the various CTA candidates for them to be able to be proficient, so that they don't get a data or security retake like I had to go through. So anyways, well, thank you so much for your time and your brilliance. So looking forward to the next episode and reconnecting with you in the very near future. And of course, you working on those new features as you come back to the nonprofits. That makes you a true treasure of the ecosystem as well as the nonprofit world. So thank you, Tyler. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Sven.